Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to this webinar. Thank you for joining what promises to be an informative, thought-provoking discussion about a recently released report conducted by the Raoul Wallenberg Centre for Human Rights on the breaches of the Genocide Convention in Darfur, Sudan. I am attorney Laverne Lewis-Gaskins, and I will be serving as the moderator for this program. We have a very distinguished panel of speakers. Joining us today by way of brief introductions are attorney Yonah Diamond. He is one of the report authors. He currently serves as the senior legal counsel of the Wallenberg Center for Human Rights. Attorney Muhtasin Ali is also one of the report authors. He currently serves as a legal advisor at the Wallenberg Center for Human Rights. And we also are joined by Professor Jennifer Trahan. She is the director of the Concentration in International Law and Human Rights at NYU Center for Global Affairs. Welcome, everyone. And let's just get started with the report itself. Attorneys Diamond and Ali, as authors of the report, can you briefly provide a background as to how you conducted your research and how you reached your findings concerning the actors within Sudan? Let's just focus on within the Sudan, and then we'll shift a little later to actors outside of Sudan.
Yeah, thanks a lot for this wonderful introduction, and really grateful to be part of this esteemed panel, thanks for highlighting this very really close issue to our hearts in a very timely time. I mean, the conflict in Darfur has been underreported. I should say actually genocide, not conflict in Darfur. We're speaking of now 20 years of continuous atrocities by the same perpetrators and the same against the same victims, and in the same geographic location, the region Darfur, Western Sudan, and so when my colleague Yon and I started working on this particular report, it was really following the outbreak of the war between the Sudanese armed forces and the rapid support forces in April 2023. I must note that these two actors, Sudanese armed forces and the rapid support forces, were aligning, right, working together in early 2000s, even until before the outbreak of the war, right? They committed serious atrocities, including the early genocide. And now, because of this war, we see a world largest humanitarian crisis looming, where more than 500,000 of Sudanese are now in need of in acute food crisis, right? Among them, 5 million children, and not to speak about nearly 8 or even more million displaced persons, internally and refugees. And so we're speaking of really a catastrophic situation in Sudan, and unfortunately, it's not being covered in the media, and also it only demonstrates the failure of the international community, right? And so this is not to say a forgotten catastrophe, a forgotten genocide. It is an abandoned genocide, right? It is not that people did not know that the atrocities are happening. They knew, everybody knew about it, but they chose not to act upon. And so we started documenting the situation primarily to raise awareness, right? To have people talk about this, right? We at the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights, first we filed a sanctions recommendations against the warring parties and the entities that are fueling the conflict. And we have sufficient evidence to say that there are a series of Sudanese individuals and also foreign actors involved in fueling the conflict in Sudan. And we've seen some of the sanctions recommendations by jurisdictions in the US, UK, EU, and recently in Canada. We spearheaded a letter where we signed by world-leading experts on genocide prevention, scholars, academics, to underscore the serious risk of genocide. And actually, not only a serious risk of genocide has already occurred, right? And so those are really some of the starting efforts. We then decided on doing something even more. Since 2005, there has never been an independent inquiry to, and again, using the Genocide Convention legal framework to investigate whether there have been breaches of the Genocide Convention or not. And therefore, we thought probably this is a critical moment, and we should lead such efforts. And we focus primarily on Darfur for a primary reason, and that is for ethnically motivated nature of the killing in Darfur, right? Of course, the war is all over Sudan, but the way the perpetrators commit atrocities in Darfur is quite different. People are being targeted because of their ethnicities. We've seen that in West Darfur in Al Janina, right? Masalit, and one of the largest ethnic groups in Darfur. Have been, executed, like searched house by house, and as you saw in the report, right? And so the way the perpetrators, the RSF, targeting the civilians in Darfur is quite different than what we saw in other parts of Sudan, and that's one of the reasons why we focus on Darfur. And so we as we embarked on this project, we consulted with Sudanese diaspora, Darfuris, and also, again, world-leading experts, just to have their reflections and whether what would be the best way to characterize this. And so we got to those conclusions. But again, I think the Darfur genocide is just really being ignored, and it is, as many of our experts demonstrated, they were preventable, right? The first genocide and now the second round of genocide, these were all preventable, and again, the world decided not to act upon.
All right, Attorney Diamond, you want to add to those comments?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Laverne, for the kind introduction, and thanks to Regina and Tim for organizing this. I just want to add, I come at this from having led 2 prior reports on analyses under the Genocide Convention, bringing together multidisciplinary groups of experts and scholars on the particular region we're looking at, and public international law and genocide experts to come to a consensus as to what types of breaches of the Genocide Convention are happening. And this kind of flows from a frustration with the international community's ability to respond to mass atrocities in real time, to protect the civilians and populations at risk while genocides are unfolding, as a separate track of justice and accountability than long-term trials and prosecutions and evidence gathering that happens down the road. And so for our report, we use different standards than a criminal court or a tribunal, where we're talking about clear and convincing evidence or reasonable grounds to believe. So when we're looking at, and all of the evidence is available, so we're looking at open source, satellite imagery analyses, remote sensing analyses, and it's all available in the nearly 400 footnotes. So the idea here is to consolidate all of the available evidence for policymakers, courts. We mentioned in the foreword that it's intended to be used by the general public and lawyers, practitioners, courts, NGOs, international NGOs, UN Security Council, and so we've reached these findings by consulting with this large group, and we examined the Genocide Convention and the broad breaches of the Genocide Convention. So whether it's direct and public incitement to commit genocide, we categorize, we use the international jurisprudence from courts and UN commissions over the years who have grappled or have interpreted the question of genocidal intent and have applied that to the facts after gathering all the facts, and come to the conclusion on clear and convincing grounds that the RSF, as a non-state actor, but a potential actor that might take over Sudan even, but that is in control of the Darfur, right now 4 states of the Darfur region, that they are responsible for the commission of genocide. And yeah, Lorraine.
Well, before we shift to the outside actors, Professor Trahan, do you want to weigh in on this discussion, this part of our discussion?
Thank you, Laverne. And first, let me thank the ABA for drawing its focus to this important report and congratulate our 2 authors from the Raoul Wallenberg Centre in their very thorough report, and the Raoul Wallenberg Centre for drawing attention. Just to emphasize some of the findings in the report, if any in the audience don't know, the Rapid Support Forces, RSF, are the continuation of the Janjaweed. So in the early 2000s, 2003, 2004, it was the government of Sudan and Janjaweed committing what was clearly genocide. And the crimes never really ceased, but now they seem to have accelerated. So why does this report come out now? Because we've seen mass killing. In one site, it's believed 10,000 to 15,000 were executed. We're seeing rape, sexual violence, torture, mass forced displacement, mass graves, enslavement. So these are our underlying crimes. And then if you go to a chart in the back of the report, you see all the expressions of genocidal intent. Kill the Nuba, which means Black Africans. It refers to the Fur-Masalit, Sagawa, and other Black African tribes in Darfur. Exterminate the 4, going door to door, asking individuals' ethnicity, calling individuals slaves, and then killing them. So the report maps out the elements of genocide and makes the case that we have the underlying crimes A, B, C, D being committed. A, killing. B, serious bodily harm. C, creating conditions of life calculated to destroy the group. And here they're additionally chronicling destruction of shelters, houses, destruction of healthcare, destruction of civilian infrastructure, and D, by rape and the means why it's committed and the ethnic utterances during which the rape is perpetrated. They make a case that this is the final crime under, or element D of the crimes of genocide. So just to lay out some of the findings in the report, I saw Greg Stanton's question, why Raoul Wallenberg Centre hadn't called this genocide before, and I think Yona will have to address this because I'm not affiliated with the Raoul Wallenberg Centre. Long ago, 2005, I published why the killing in 2003, 2004 was clearly genocide. And the problem is we're seeing a direct resurgence, and we never had accountability for the crimes to begin with. So we've had almost complete impunity, and I think we'll later talk about accountability. So I'll wait for that discussion.
Well, thank you for those responses, but let's shift our conversation, our discussion to the outside actors with this genocide. Can you talk about the research and the background that you engaged in concerning outside actors who were identified as being involved in the genocide? we'll let the authors go first. And then, of course, Professor Trahan, if you want to weigh in on this part of our discussion, please, you're encouraged to do so. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'll start us off. In January, the panel of experts on Sudan for the UN released their report, and it's well worth looking at. We rely on it quite a bit in the report, and their findings identify explicitly the outside actors from the report, including the UAE specifically, for both its financial and military backing of the RSF through Chad and the CAR, even for recruitment purposes. And so that's an important source, but it's also kind of been an open secret, been reported on widely that the UAE is the main sponsor of the RSF, going back to the war in Yemen in terms of fighting alongside the Saudi-led coalition there. And there are also other NGOs that have documented, like Klingendale and others, Global Witness, who have documented the RSF's financing network and how they're able to operate. And so that's sort of what we looked into. And we've also, a number of our contributors are at the Sentry, and they're really the leading institution working on tracking the financial and illicit flows that fuel the RSF. And so our findings are based on these, and we also consulted with open source experts early on about tracking the flight. I mean, the aircraft coming from the UAE to deliver supplies through Chad to the RSF. And so, I mean, this is extremely critical for accountability purposes, because once these actors are identified and the activity that is actually directly contributing to the genocide, that's what now practitioners and policymakers can now directly target through sanctions and lawsuits, and any sort of companies connected to those or being supported by these actors. So yeah, I'll see if Mutassim has anything to add.
Yeah, no, I think that's all about it. I think some of the, I mean, I don't know if we were speaking of domestic actors as well, but I think, you know, some of these actors have already been associated with the Sudanese armed forces and the rapid support forces, right? For example, entities have been sanctioned by the U.S. government that are based in the UAE and the like. And as you may have seen, the report primarily focuses on the rapid support forces and not the Sudanese armed forces, in part because we really do not have, you know, we could not find sufficient evidence at this point in time to say that the Sudanese armed forces, you know, has engaged in genocide in the context of the current war. That is primarily, you know, the rapid support forces basically retreated Sudanese armed forces from many of the, you know, South garrisons in Darfur, except for North Darfur al-Fashir, right? And therefore, you know, Sudanese armed forces has less presence, if at all, in Darfur. And so that's one of the reasons why the focus has been only primarily on the RSF. We also indicated that this report, of course, the prime focus is the, you know, breaches of the Genocide Convention, but it could be used to investigate further crimes, war crimes and crimes against humanity, which both SAF and the RSF may have, you know, engaged in.
Thank you. Professor Trahan?
Yeah, thanks. Again, I want to commend the report authors in making their thorough case of the outside supporters, UAE, CAR, Chad, the Wagner Group with potentially its ties to Russia and Libya, as all playing some kind of role in funding and supplying arms, building airfields, etc. Why does this matter? Well, in terms of state responsibility, I know we have probably a bunch of lawyers on this. We can go to the RCWA, Articles of Responsibility of States for Internationally Wrongful Acts, said a state must not aid or assist another state in the commission of an internationally wrongful act. Basically, this is all about peremptory norms of international law, of which genocide is one, the prohibition against committing genocide, if the state does so with knowledge of the circumstances. And the act would be internationally wrongful if committed by that state. Well, this seems easily satisfied. In terms of state responsibility, we also have our RCWA Article 41. States shall cooperate to bring to an end breaches of peremptory norms of international law, and may not render aid or assistance in maintaining such a situation. So all of these obligations are being breached. And then, of course, the Genocide Convention in Article 3E prohibits complicity in genocide. So we have a layer of individual criminal responsibility potentially as well.
All right, thank you so much for that. We have this great, wonderful, comprehensive report, right? And you've done a fabulous job in pulling this together. Can each of you explain, from your perspective, what's the importance of this report? What is the essence of, why do we need this report? And why is it so important?
Yeah, maybe, okay, Professor, go ahead. Yeah,
okay.
please.
Thank you. Well, the world largely ignored the genocide in 2003, 2004. And this seems a repeat of that genocide. In the past, we believe in the height of the killing, there may have been as many as 450,000 killed. Again, it's ethnically targeted killing against the Black African tribes of Darfur by then it was the government of Sudan and the Janjaweed militia, and it was basically a scorched earth campaign of killing, serious bodily harm, rape, torture, and creating conditions of life calculated to destroy the group, seizing the cattle, selling them on secondary markets, burning villages, putting bodies down wells to pollute water sources. Nothing was left behind, and this was a coordinated attack. But unfortunately, we had very little response from the world, despite fairly broad recognition this was genocide, although we did spend years with having that debate, and that's always very frustrating when we get stuck in the debate. Well, is it genocide? Like, well, if it is, maybe we should do something. Well, if it's war crimes and crimes against humanity, action must be taken. So let's not waste time in the debate. We always waste time in this debate. We had little response from the international community initially. Part of it, I will say, is due to Chinese veto threats. So instead of strong Security Council resolutions in the early 2000s, we see China watering them down. I've written about this in my book. I'll put the title in the chat. In the 5th chapter, I do a chronology of the accelerating crimes in Darfur and Chinese efforts to weaken the Security Council's response, weaken the sanctions regime, weaken the deployment of peacekeepers, and they ultimately delayed it, and the peacekeepers get there when the height of the killing is all over. Well, now we're seeing a resurgence in ethnically motivated killing, and we have to sound the alarms when the rapid support forces are the continuation of the Janjaweed. I think the report puts states on notice, but we have to also just factor in, it's very hard to get the world's attention today. I would say starting with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, all eyes were on Ukraine. I would say today, all the media seems to be on Israel, Gaza. And I'm not saying we shouldn't have media attention on those situations, but there are other situations that warrant our attention. And unfortunately, particularly in the US, we have a lack of attention to things in Africa. And this report is an important contribution to sounding the alarm bell for the international community, that their obligation to prevent genocide is triggered because there is at least a serious risk. And that is our trigger for when states must start acting. But there are also obligations related to war crimes and crimes against humanity. So I just want to put that on the table too. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Professor Trahan. Attorneys Diamond and Ali, in your response to what you perceive as the value of the report, could you also address this issue of why you think the international community has failed to respond appropriately to this genocide? We're talking about both past acts and Darfur and the current condition.
Okay, I'll leave this part of the question perhaps to my colleague Fiona, but I think, you know, Professor Trahan eloquently put it. I mean, you know, the genocide, and I mean, usually the international community not only acts, but usually, you know, condemns and calls for restraint when genocide is already complete, right? We're speaking of the hallmark of the genocide, you know, convention is to prevent genocide from happening. We failed to do so 20 years ago. We failed to do so last year when the Masalid in West Darfur were killed. Although we've seen indications prior to the commission of genocide in West Darfur, right? People talked about it, the victims spoke, and yet we did not do anything. And I think the importance of this report is that as we speak right now, the RSF is actually recruiting and rallying its troops in and around Al-Fashir. And so basically, you know, unfortunately, we may see what happened in West Darfur against the Masalid group, you know, happens again in Al-Fashir. It is really a matter of when, it's not a matter of if, right? Because we, you know, we speak to people and we see that the RSF is really determined to do the same. And this is in part because, you know, there has never been accountability, as Professor Rohan said before, right? Perpetrators fear no justice. They have never seen one. And the saddest part, by the way, is that, you know, perpetrators document their, you know, violations, you know, live on social media platforms, right? We will see rape cases on TikTok or Twitter or Facebook, you know, execution of Masalid men and the like. And so, and that, you know, there are primarily two reasons, right? They fear no accountability, but also it's a part of humiliation. And so I think if there is one importance to this report is really to prevent what will happen in Al-Fashir soon.
Thank you. Attorney Diamond.
Yeah, sure. I mean, yeah, both my colleagues have put it really well. And so primarily, the primary purpose is prevention and to sound the alarm and to gain media attention and internationally public awareness, because that is really lacking. And if you look at the reports around Al-Fashir now, words can't even describe how catastrophic it will be. And so we can no longer say we don't know. We've seen the patterns going back 20 years, and now we've demonstrated and outlined these patterns very clearly. And so this report should be used as a predictive device right now, because you know, Al-Fashir is home to 2 million civilians, and Zamzam IDP camp, where in February already a child was dying every 2 hours, according to Médecins Sans Frontières. So the communities there are already lacking civilian infrastructure, food, water, basic necessities, and they're now under siege by the RSF and are on the verge of facing the same genocide that happened, continuing genocide. And so that is just the most important priority right now, and we're hoping that this report will also build the momentum for maybe an emergency UN Security Council session, anything that can be sort of emergency sessions in any forum to raise the profile and get the necessary and rally the necessary action. But you know, of course, it's also an accountability mechanism, and by that I want to build off what Professor Trehan was saying about you know, holding the outside actors accountable under international law. This report, I want to emphasize, has the contributions. If you look at our list of 30 names, it includes, you know, the head of the UN Legal Affairs Department, a former head and current head of the International Association of Genocide Scholars, the founding prosecutors of the International Criminal Tribunals, Professor Trehan, of course, and so we have a really, we've been careful, and it's important to note the selection of our former Supreme Court justices, and not just Western, but we're talking about a diverse group from around the world, representing different regions, so different traditions of law, and coming at it. And so coming to the same conclusions together gives this report the weight of now a source of international law. It's not just an NGO report, it's actually a source of international law now that can be used before the ICJ, before courts, before international organizations, in the same way that, because a lot of these individuals have served on other commissions, this now has the weight of that sort of what's called a subsidiary means of international law, but it's a source of international law. And so for accountability purposes, it can now be used as a basis for other actions like sanctions, accountability mechanisms, to enforce the arms embargo, to get states individually to do these things, and then to also even sue and to take a case to the ICJ based on what we've already documented as breaches of the Genocide Convention, and the Commission of Genocide, and it imposes the obligation on all states to prevent and employ all means reasonably available. And so this report now opens a lot of these accountability doors, and we're hoping it can actually be implemented by the right people.
I'm going to shift our conversation to the International Criminal Court, but before I do that, Professor Trehan, did you want to make another comment before we move on?
Yeah, I just wanted to add onto that one. So Article 1 of the Genocide Convention is the obligation to prevent genocide, as mentioned, triggered when there's a serious risk. And as Yona mentioned, it's states, it's like a due diligence obligation. States have to do what is in their capacity of influence. So we can all imagine, he mentioned sanctions, a ceasefire under Chapter 7, not just during Ramadan, but at Chapter 7 ceasefire. I see Darfur Women Action Group this morning calling for the authorization of a protection force, unhindered humanitarian access into El Fasher, and accountability. So these are all things that could go into a council resolution. But I do see the question Gregory Stanton poses to us about the veto. But what I would say to that is we shouldn't just say, oh, China will veto, let's not do any of these things. Let's not try any of this. First, I would push E10 states to propose these measures. Let the world, if China is going to veto all these things, let the world see and put the to a vote, because too often I think states on the Security Council self-censor themselves. They're like, oh, China would veto, so we just won't even try these things. Well, states need some courage and they need to push these things. And if China is going to veto, then they're going to veto. But then maybe at least the world will have seen. Maybe it can be a call for the General Assembly to take up these measures. I know they would be merely recommendations, but the General Assembly can make recommendations for whatever the Security Council is failing to do, and then states potentially can commit to them on a kind of bilateral basis, hopefully the whole UNGA. So I think it is difficult when you know there's a permanent member out there willing to cast its veto, but I think one needs to proceed notwithstanding. And potentially maybe someday we'll bring a legal challenge to some of these vetoes.
Thank you so much for those responses, but let's shift our attention to the International Criminal Court. And how do you think the International Criminal Court investigation and cases could be strengthened? And is there a likelihood that the ICC prosecutor could look to prosecute non-state actors? Who wants to go first?
I'm happy to start off unless Yona wants to start off.
No, you can start us off.
Okay, well, so the ICC has proceeded. They have the Bashir indictment and 3 additional indictments. But most individuals are at large. They only have 1 individual in custody. So when you have one, they're doing 1 case. So we can kind of think of 450,000 potentially dead and 1 case. Okay, that's where we are. Now, the ICC can't act unless states arrest individuals. So when the ICC has warrants, that means all 124 states parties have an arrest obligation, and they need to use these. And there need to be efforts made to get Bashir to The Hague, because we need accountability. We need strong accountability. There is 1 case against Ali Kushayb, John Jouid militia commander, for crimes against humanity and war crimes. The Bashir indictment includes genocide. So states need to help ensure that individuals end up in The Hague. The ICC has also opened additional investigations and obviously needs to do far more. But then ideally one would have accountability beyond the ICC. The ICC can only do a handful of cases in each situation, and that's why it's really important that there be additional accountability mechanisms. And we have just absolutely seen, you know, so little in reaction to the situation in Darfur, despite the Security Council referral to the ICC. So much needs to be done, but the ICC can't be the only actor. And as mentioned so far, it's not only criminal accountability, it's state responsibility. We could see ICJ cases for complicity by the states that are complicit. We could see a ICJ case against Darfur for genocide. These would be state responsibility cases under the Genocide Convention. Sudan is a state party. So thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll add that our report only looks at state or entity responsibility, as Professor Trahan was mentioning. And so we don't look at individual criminal accountability at all. It's a separate legal regime we are applying. At the same time, you know, our hope is that this can be used by the International Criminal Court potentially in bringing charges of genocide. What's kind of shocking, though, is, I mean, it's an unprecedented situation in many ways, but this is a genocide recurring within the lifespan of the ICC itself. Right, so the ICC established in 2002, and within these short, just over 2 decades, you know, issuing the first genocide charge against Bashir, and now again genocide recurring, is perhaps you know, the most obvious sign that that accountability at the International Criminal Court cannot alone prevent atrocities or serve as a sufficient form of justice and deterrence. And so we're coming from it to a complementary angle to complement the ICC's efforts, but to bring justice sooner and to bring protection sooner, and not wait for years down the road, investigations and or even symbolic arrest warrants to come out, because we're looking at how to really impose costs on the most responsible entities while they're committing genocide.
And if I may chime in here quickly, I think, while we emphasize the important role of the ICC, right, in investigating and bringing, senior perpetrators to account, I do think that most of the time the ICC is involved in situations when atrocities have already been committed, right, complete. And now the larger question is, what form of accountability mechanism that will be helpful to prevent atrocity from happening in the first place. And I think that is exactly the reason why we think our framework, right, the Genocide Convention, is critical by holding state actors involved in, in the commission or breaching of the Genocide Convention to the account.
I want to add quickly that there's not yet a Crimes Against Humanity treaty passed, but enacted, but we would look at breaches of the Crimes Against Humanity treaty if it were in existence. I mean, because there's plenty of evidence as well of crimes against humanity. And then that would impose on states also duties to end complicity and prevent. But right now, the only treaty and the most fundamental treaty out there is the Genocide Convention, and that, so that's the one we looked at. Yeah.
And maybe I'll just add in, I mean, that's at the level of state responsibility, but at the level of individual criminal responsibility, the ICC, yes, often comes in when the crimes are all over, but actually, I mean, it's active in Ukraine now and the crimes are still occurring. So the ICC could come in now. They are investigating. We hope they will. I see the question, could Hamedi and Buran both be charged with war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide? That the ICC could pursue this now. And even the prosecutor making some kind of statement that his, about focus on these crimes, you hope might have some potential chilling effect. The ICC doesn't have to wait till the crimes are over. It certainly did, and for the height of the killing, nothing in 2003, 2004, the ICC was not yet active. But the referral is active, so the ICC has jurisdiction and could move forward now.
I have one final question before we move into questions from the audience that's currently in the chat. The report mentions gold mining, and can you elaborate more on the environmental issues fueling genocide? And do these environmental issues warrant further analysis?
Yeah, well, I can briefly speak about that. I think, we've seen in the past couple of years, I think actually since 2015, the RSF has been investing a lot in gold mining, and that has been a critical, financial resource for the RSF to build its empire. And that's how they made a lot of money. And the gold has always been exported to the UAE and in certain situations to Russia. But to the larger environmental aspect of this, indeed, I mean, some view the conflict as, over the resources and over the land, water, and things like that. And definitely that plays a big part of the conflict as well. But I do think that the RSF, the Janjaweed at the time, prime intent was to change the demographic, structure of Darfur, and that's really the main drive behind the genocidal acts. but surely the environmental aspect of this is a big part of the conflict.
All right.
I would maybe just add in that the ICC also can currently factor in environmental degradation in the crimes it currently has. The last crime against humanity is other inhumane acts, and that has been used to consider what is happening to the environment. And the war crime in terms of collateral damage also in the ICC statute factors in environmental degradation as a war crime. So the ICC can currently proceed related to environmental crimes. I know it's going to issue a policy paper on that topic. It's, I think, going to be its next policy paper. And then some have advocated that we should incorporate the crime of ecocide directly into the statute. It isn't currently there. But one other topic, I'll just take 1 second to say that we haven't hit on. We've been talking about the obligation to prevent genocide. And I think what is too often under-ignored is Common Article 1 of the Geneva Conventions that obligates states to ensure respect for the Geneva Conventions. This is a due diligence obligation to make sure there aren't war crimes. So it's not just an obligation to prevent genocide, but they're due diligence obligations. And the ICJ has recognized as binding obligations, not just on states not to commit war crimes, but to ensure others do not do so. So that is also an obligation that's triggered. I believe there are obligations to prevent crimes against humanity, but until we have a treaty passed that says obligation to prevent, but I do think they can be derived through customary international law. So I think these obligations exist as well.
Thank you so much. I'm going to read some of the questions that have surfaced in the chat. Attorney Diamond, this one is directed to you. Please give the legal reasons this report says that this is genocide and not merely a risk of genocide, as your previous report claimed. How have the facts changed, and why didn't your earlier report state that this was genocide?
Yeah, that's a good question. First I'll say that, our approach does not look at genocide, as you know, as a singular event, but as a process. And so for us, it's not one single moment when it turns into a genocide. However, the open letter, it wasn't a report, but the open letter we put out in November was a chance to bring together as many experts as possible. And so we spoke of the serious risk of genocide, knowing that the people we're asking to sign on aren't going to look into the question of genocide itself, because that would require much more substantive research. And that, so that's what we did for this report. And so I wouldn't say there was any, one event that changed the status from serious risk. And I think that there's an interplay because, of course, while the RSF is continuing its campaign, the serious risk of genocide is still there. And what we're saying is it's responsible for committing and having committed genocide. So I would say that they both apply. Our finding that they have committed is a little more definitive now that we've had the time to review, but the serious risk is now cannot be denied, especially when it says imminent, as what's happening around El Fasher.
Thank you. There's another question. What is the role of the African Union in this, and what obligations do they have?
Yeah, sure. So just to contextualize this, I think the African Union at the start of the genocide in Darfur in the early 2000s, played a big role, partly by sending African Union mission in Darfur, right, at the time, and then it was sort of it became the UNAMID, the African Union, the United Nations Africa Mission in Darfur together, and the forces were mandated to monitor human rights situation in Darfur, but not necessarily protecting civilians. And so we've seen a series of violations, even when the forces were in Darfur at the time. And I think it was in June 2020 when the UNAMID forces were withdrawn from Darfur by the UN Security Council resolution. And unfortunately, that was a huge mistake. And that's exactly the reason why I think another reason to say the international community failed the people of Darfur. And instead of changing the mandate of the UNAMID forces to and give them the tools to protect civilians, they withdrew the forces completely from Darfur, and that was a major blow. And so that only complicated, the process of now protecting the civilians under this circumstance. I agree with Greg. It is unlikely, perhaps impossible, to send troops to protect civilians in Darfur because of the veto and the dynamics at the UN Security Council and the like. And therefore, and ever since, the African Union's role became very marginal, primarily on a peace process, a sham peace process. And I do not believe that negotiations between the rapid support forces and Sudanese armed forces will put an end to the rising, incitement and hate and systematic killing of non-Arabs in Darfur. And so, unfortunately, I really do not see or foresee any big role for the African or any other sub-regional organization that will halt the atrocities in Darfur. And I think the international community should think of a different thing, such as at least in the context of the potential attack on Al-Fashir, providing safe passage to civilians who are at risk, and I think that would be the one critical thing to provide at this point in time.
All right, thank you so much for that. I do believe we have time for perhaps one or maybe two other questions. The question is, can you comment on the suit against the French bank PNB over its alleged role in Sudan's genocide, if you're familiar with that case?
Would you like to take that, or?
I'm not too familiar, but I know it's about sanctions evasion at the time in early 2000s, and I would just say that one would hope that there were more suits like this around the world under various jurisdictions for tort statutes and the like that allow for claims against banks or companies for either evading, getting around a sanctions regime, or for their complicity in violations of serious breaches of international law. So I really wish there were more and more of these sort of civil suits, because it's again, this is the prevention of genocide, accountability and justice for genocide is such it requires the involvement of really more lawyers and the international community. So
yeah, I think rightly put it. I think the BMP case is really primarily about sanctions evasion, which included the violations not only in the Darfur region but also the larger Sudan, including the South Sudan now as an independent state. But I think what the case symbolizes is another form of accountability, right? Like, ICC is one, ICJ is another one, and perhaps other unilateral forms of accountability. But I think this is another form which it is critical in terms of, redressing the victims of human rights abuses at large. Yeah.
All right. We have time for one more question. I'd like each one of you to respond to this before we close out this session. What role can civil society groups play in raising awareness and advocating for action based on the findings presented in the report, and what guidance would you offer them?
Yeah, I'll come in quickly as well. First, I think as we drafted this report, we actually just realized that we just scratched the surface, and there's so much that can be done. And I do think that there is an sort of investigation gap. I think that's where many civil society groups can also involve. And I think the other thing could be combating incitement and hate speech. And I think this is primarily on social media platforms. And I mean, I a little bit personally, like, try not to get into TikTok and other social media platforms because it's really terrible, the level of hate and incitement against non-Arabs, which we know the events that will follow. And so I think civil society can definitely play a role in that. And in terms of guidance and the like, I think they just need to talk about the findings of the report, and especially if we're speaking here in the U.S., people can speak to their constituents, to their representatives, and I think one of the main issue that we all of us highlighted here is that this is really not being talked about. The issue of Darfur is overshadowed by other conflicts, and this should not be a competition of misery. But I do think that we're speaking of genocide here, and therefore there needs to be an action that corresponds to the magnitude and the gravity of the abuses.
All right.
Yona, do you want to go next, or should I?
You can go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. So I would say, what can civil society groups do? What can individuals do? As was just eloquently stated, raise the alarm bells. Genocide has resumed. I think we've laid out a number of steps that could be taken by states on the Security Council, and if it's vetoed, then it can go to the General Assembly, but states also bilaterally. I see that 2 days ago, the U.S. State Department called on all armed forces in Sudan to immediately cease attacks in El Fasher, North Darfur. But it's one thing for the U.S. to call on this. It would be so much more powerful. It could come from the UN Security Council. So pressure on states. The second is we need the ICC. How powerful would it be if states actually work to get Bashir in The Hague? These things don't just happen. Unless a state is going to work this issue, this will not happen. And how powerful would that be, or other Janjaweed commanders? But we need states to support the ICC in these endeavors. It can't do this by itself. And it was so important, the highlighting of social media platforms, because we're in a new era. It's called cyber incitement to genocide. So one of the other forthcoming policy papers of the ICC is going to be cyber as playing a role in each of the Rome Statute crimes. And in the way we used to have newspaper and radio inciting genocide, for instance, in Rwanda, we now have it done online. Well, this is cyber incitement, and we need to start focusing on this. And I think that the ICC has now focused on this. The prosecutor has recognized that cyber is a means by which all 4 of the Rome Statute crimes can be committed. And this is another important angle just to awareness raise, and it's a new way that the crimes are being committed. Thanks.
Right. I think we're running out of time, but Attorney Diamond, let me say this before we close out, because I don't want to miss this opportunity. I certainly want to thank Professor Trahan, Attorney Ali, and Attorney Diamond for your expertise and participation in this very, very important program. And with that being said, Attorney Diamond, I think you'll have the final say.
Oh, I just no, I can't really top that. I think that it was all said really well, and I just think in general that everyone involved, civil society, lawyers, policymakers, it has to be seen as a sort of relying on each other's resources and sort of a collective responsibility rather than seeing things in silos with the ICC working on one thing, you know, a particular human rights organization working on one thing, rather see it as a joint effort. And so even when talking about, so like the social media issue and incitement to genocide online, that could again like form the basis of a suit against a social media company, or for a civil society organization to raise this in their submissions to a social media company. I mean, so this should just be seen as a collective, interconnected effort.
Thank you all. Tim, I think I'll turn it over to you at this time.
All right, well, that'll do it for today. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to all of our guests and to everyone for participating. We will be back next month for another webinar, so stay tuned for that. I appreciate everyone for coming. This has been a fascinating presentation, and it's a fascinating report. Encourage everyone to read it. It's available online, and it's just brilliant. Thank you, everyone, and have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you
Bye.
so much. Appreciate it. Bye-bye.
Thank you.